Go. Now, I don't want to scare anyone, but I'm going to give it to you straight about Stephen. His body was never recovered from the bookstore after he toured. And if you listen to the old-timers in town, they'll tell you that he's still out there. Some sort of demented creature, surviving in the aisles, full grown by now, stalking, stealing what books he needs, living off of his fans and vegetation. Well, some folks claim that they've even seen him right in this area. The girl that survived that night at StokerCon, she claims she saw him. She disappeared 2 months later, vanished, blood was everywhere. No one knows what happened to her. But legend has it that Stephen saw his editor beheaded that night, and he took his revenge. A revenge that he'll continue to seek if anyone ever enters this bookstore again. And by now, well, I guess you all know that we are the first to return. 5 years. 5 long years he has been dormant, and he's hungry. Stephen Graham Jones is out there, watching, always on the prowl for readers, waiting to kill, to devour, thirsty for fearmongers. And I am your host, Clay McLeod Chapman. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for what will be going down in history as maybe the first ever slasher symposium. That's not true. There's probably been a million slasher symposiums at this point. But I am so fortunate to have none other than the author of Heads Will Roll, Burn the Negative, and many, many more. Josh Winning, coming from Suffolk. If Josh freezes, just look at him for a little bit. He will come back. He is coming and going from across the pond. So, hey, Josh, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
He is real. He is alive. We have him for right now. So if he disappears, just look out behind you because he's probably going to pop up behind your shoulder. Author of such books as Frostbite and Shopping Spree, we have with us all the way from Colorado, Angela Sylvaine. Angela, how you doing?
I am wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
God, this is amazing. I'm so excited. I feel like a little kid in a candy store tonight. So thank you, thank you, thank you. From Arizona, writer of such books as Curse the Reaper of the Reaper. Candy Cane, not only Candy Cane Kills, but Candy Cane Kills Again. And I have to ask, will there be Candy Cane Kills Again and Again? Brian McAuley. Hello, Brian.
Hey, Clay. Thanks so much for having me.
This is so much fun. I love your choice of sweater wear tonight. So you dressed for the occasion. Author of I Was a Teenage Slasher, the Indian Lake Trilogy, and so many more. We have Stephen Graham Jones. Hey, Stephen, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And you're in Colorado as well, or are you
I am.
elsewhere?
Yeah.
Oh
Angela and
my
I are
God.
probably on the same trunk line in some fashion.
Oh
Yeah.
my God. Well, keep that Wi-Fi going strong, guys. I really appreciate you all for joining us tonight. And you know, it's funny because the idea for tonight came about because all the way back in January, I actually saw Stephen when he came through town to kind of talk about the release of I Was a Teenage Slasher, and there was this moment that really kind of like struck me, and it's the idea of like I I want to think that maybe slashers are having a moment, like the like slasher fiction in particular, and this kind of struck me as being really kind of like interesting and kind of like I don't know, like a certain kind of cognitive dissonance of like how slasher fiction exists in in this kind of publishing climate. And so I think like straight out of the gates, and I will kind of call just to kind of avoid confusion with so many of our panelists tonight, but I kind of want to kind of speak specifically about the kind of renaissance that we are in at this moment, and whether that's what's happening in theaters, whether that's what's happening on the bookshelves. Like, I want to talk about why slashers are having a moment again. And Angela, forgive me, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you have any thoughts on this question?
Sure. It's always nice to be called on first, because then by the end, like, you run out of answers. So that's totally cool. And I think the reason they're having a moment, A, is because they're fun. Listen, we love them. I still love the old slashers. I love the new slashers. They're just a good time, both in movie and in book form. But I think particularly in literature and in books, they're having kind of a moment because people are discovering how much more you can do with it. You're sort of limited in movies to how much depth you can give your characters and how much maybe you can play with the tropes and audience expectations. You can do some interesting things, but I think there's far more potential in books to get into depth on, the villains, the actual slashers. Many of those on this call have done that, where you can dive deep and ask those questions of, like, how much of a villain are they really? Are they 100% a villain? Maybe I have some sympathy for them. Maybe they can even be the main character. Same thing with the final girls. They can have depth. They don't have to be perfect. And they're developed into like these real characters. So I think that's part of why it's having a resurgence, is because we're discovering all the ways we can just like plumb the depths of what a slasher could be.
Josh is wriggling, so I feel like we still have him at the moment. So I'm going to to ask you the same question. Why do you think we're in the midst of a renaissance?
I completely agree with Angela. I couldn't really put it any better than she did, to be honest. But I think that, yeah, a big part of it is that it's fun. I think that, we've had a lot of so-called elevated horror movies, which are, films like Hereditary and Midsommar, basically anything by Ari Aster. And I think that maybe people are looking now for a bit more fun in their horror. That's certainly what I'm doing as a reader. And I think that, I'm really enjoying the fact that we have had this slasher renaissance as a reader myself, because it's almost like we've become this little club as lovers of slashers, where it's like, for so long the slasher was looked down upon as sort of like the dregs of the horror genre. But I think that now it's okay to say, I love slashers proudly. I'm slasher and proud. And it's a safe space for us. They're fun party books, and it's okay to love them.
Yeah. Brian, I'm totally curious because, I mean, I'm thinking of everybody who is here tonight, but also people like Adam Caesar, Grady Hendrix. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on. And is there ever the moment where you're kind of like hanging out at an event and you just so happen to be kind of in the company of fellow kind of slasher authors, and like, do you ever compare notes? Is there ever kind of a conversation amongst those writers who have kind of like dabbled in this particular subgenre?
That's a great question. I mean, I got to spend time with all of these three wonderful authors at StokerCon recently, and be on panels and chat about it, and just I feel like more than comparing notes, we just nerd out together. I think like that's the great thing about being an author and a slasher author, is that first and foremost we're just deep fans of the subgenre. So it's more like, asking Stephen if he's seen the new Scream yet, and like, catching up on the movies that we know we're all watching and are desperate to talk about with the people who have this shared language. And that's one of the things I love most about slashers as a subgenre, is that it is a shared language, because there are so many kind of structural tropes and character archetypes that are built into it. And that for me is part of the fun, is to lean into them at some turns and then turn them on their heads at others. And you can do that because you can trust that your audience knows the language that you're speaking in.
That's totally interesting. I mean, it's funny because, like, okay, Stephen, I'm thinking of The Last Final Girl, which came out, I want to say 2014. Is that true? 2011?
I think it was 2012, maybe.
2012.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you go back 10 plus years and you're kind of looking at the kind of what's on the bookshelf, like at that point, did you say to yourself, I mean, were there other slasher novels kind of in the sphere? Like, is there something that you could kind of say, like, here were my fellow slasher compatriots at that point?
No, there weren't. There was my memory of all the novelizations I read in the 80s, of Jason and Michael and everybody, but those were always not as satisfying as I was looking for. I
Yeah.
wanted original stuff, of course. And um I don't know why it didn't happen earlier than it did, really. My suspicion is that the kind of slasher fatigue that the audience felt come about 89 or 90. um it lasted, what, 6 years until Scream reinvigorated things. But look how fast it burned out. It burned out in 4.5 years, because
Yeah.
we already remembered that old fatigue, and it was able to activate again really quickly. But then when the slasher started to ascend again, it wasn't with a big bomb drop like Scream or Halloween. It was with little stuff happening, like Hatchet, like Tucker and Dale. Then Cabin in the Woods was, it was a lot bigger than those. But then we kind of veered off into It Follows and The Final Girls, and came up through, what, Happy Death Day, Freaky. All it the ball, I feel like, got rolling slower, and because it got rolling slower, it was able to impact the bookshelf a little bit, and that makes me really happy, I mean, the I guess the cynical way to think about it is that the slasher subgenre was an unexploited, like, category, and all of us here are exploiting it. But I don't think that any of us are that mercenary. I think, like Brian was saying, we're all just like weirdo slasher people, and we want to live in slashers, and
Yeah.
if we can trick publishers into publishing our ridiculous slasher stuff, then we'll keep doing it as long as we can. But when you were asking that question, I was trying to think, where did this current, like, slasher novel thing start? And I'm not sure. Like, maybe Gina Walsdorf's Security, but I don't, was that like 2017, 2018, something like that? I don't know.
Yeah, it was definitely pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, it's funny because like it seems so ubiquitous now. Like I feel like it's something that you know, we're really entrenched in it. And maybe that's
Mhm.
because I mean, I love the fact that like there is a sequel to Candy Cane Kills, and I love the fact that there's
Mhm.
like a trilogy of Clown in the Cornfields, and like that it's
Mhm.
it's it's kind of pushing, it's using the kind of vernacular of cinema, but bringing it to publishing, which makes me want to ask a question to everybody. I really want to kind of parse out, like, it's not so much chicken and egg, but like what does slasher fiction take from cinema, from horror films, and what does it kind of push past? And Angela, you kind of started talking about it, and I feel like I kind of want to follow up with you, where it's this idea of like, what is what is slasher fiction capable of doing that slasher cinema, horror films are not capable of doing?
Yeah, and I think it kind of films probably really are about tropes because they have to be quick and to the point and sort of meet expectations, I think, to a degree. So I think that's what fiction takes from film is the basics of kind of what are the slasher tropes that you have to work with. But then we each can take them and lend our own kind of depth to it and twist the trope in some way. Like I personally love writing nostalgia horror, and I love like living in the 80s and 90s and thinking about both the good and bad aspects of that. So, like for me personally, when I look at tropes, I try to think about how I can twist those to live in the world that I like and make them kind of nostalgic and play on that. So, one example would be in Chopping Spree. It takes place in a mall, which is like fun and it's like a locked setting. So, it works in a lot of ways, but it actually became anti capitalistic. So, it's kind of like anti capitalist slasher, which is like my own twist on it that I was able to bring my experience to loving living in that world of nostalgia.
Yeah. Brian, I I feel like, knowing that you've written for film and knowing that you are this kind of perfect Venn diagram of both what's been on the screen and what's been in the page. Like, I'm really curious to hear your kind of thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it really comes back to character, and the fun that I get to have in writing novels and fiction versus film is that I get to go inside these characters' heads and explore them with so much more depth. And I think that works really well for slasher fiction in particular, because as Angela was saying, there's so many tropes of the genre in film. And I feel like one of the tropes are those kind of stock character archetypes, right? Of like the stoner, the jock, like, and they are often one-dimensional in film, in slasher films, and you don't get to know them with as much depth, at least not always. And in fiction, for me, it's much more interesting to have the opportunity to like really get into all these characters, to love them all and care about them all, so that when the bodies start piling up, you actually have some bigger feelings about it, ideally. And that's just such a privilege of writing fiction, that you get to go into the psychological depths with them.
So you get to be more sadistic, is basically what you're saying. We actually genuinely care for the characters. They're not the kind of stock, stereotypical, jock or whomever, and then you still kill them. And then...
Exactly. That's what we're doing here, right? We're just trying to hurt everybody's feelings.
I mean, I want to kind of push a little bit further, Brian, because like at least with Curse of the Reaper, that started off as a screenplay, correct?
It did, yeah. So I wrote it as a feature-length script, and that was much more kind of a 75% focused on the main character Howard, 25% with Trevor. And when I adapted it to fiction is when I went much deeper into the Trevor character, and it became more of a two-hander. And I added a lot more kind of character development scenes because I had the opportunity to do so. And also because it's more kind of psychological horror, I was like, all right, we're going to get literally into this character's head and what they're thinking and what they're fearing and all of that. So it was a really fun adaptation process for me, to go take it in that direction.
Josh, we're kind of talking a lot about tropes and this idea of like, having fun with the trope, but kind of expanding on the trope, kind of exploring the trope. I know with like Heads Will Roll, there's this kind of notion of cancel culture. And I love the idea that like, whether it's consumerism, speaking, tackling religion, talking about something that kind of has its root in kind of contemporary culture. I wonder if you can kind of speak about the rules. Like we come to slashers, and I mean like just the scream of it all. Like we've kind of like, we could probably recite the monologue right now. Like, don't you know the rules? Like, do this. I mean, there's tropes, but like in terms of the rules of a slasher novel, are they abiding by the same cinematic rules? Like, do they play in the same sandbox? Is it the same guidebook, or is it something else? Is it different?
I guess there's a certain level of expectation that people will come to the books with. They'll expect certain things that are sort of typical of a slasher movie. But we've talked about, it's such a well-known formula, that sandbox. Everyone's played in that sandbox. So I think that there is a certain level of expectation that you kind of have to lean into in order to not feel like you aren't actually doing your job as a slasher writer. You've got to have the epic chase scenes, you've got to have sort of elaborate deaths, you've got to have like a plucky group of characters. I think those are kind of things that kind of are quite immovable within the subgenre, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're restricting. There are so many things that you can have fun playing around with, just like Brian and Angela said. There are so many different tropes and cliches that you can come at from a fresh angle and kind of think, well, what is my take on this specific thing? And yeah, for me with Heads Will Roll, it was thinking about, everyone's seen a million Friday the 13th summer camp slasher movies. We've all seen Sleepaway Camp 1, 2, and 3. So what would I actually
people
be able
seen
to...
Sleepaway Camp 2 and 3? That's a deep cut.
They're out there. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I interrupted.
But I actually keep thinking about what Grady Hendrix said in a previous episode of Fearmongers, where he talked about the dog trying to get the peanut butter out of the chew toy thing. And I think that is such a great analogy that I can't better in any way, because I really think it does apply to slasher really well. You know, you've got the chew toy, which everyone loves, but what have you got inside of it? What is the peanut butter? And that's kind of the fun challenge of doing slasher, which is, you know, everyone knows what a slasher is, but what can we do that's different within those parameters?
Yeah, yeah. Stephen, I feel as if, you know, reading the Indian Lake trilogy, you know, you're having this conversation with the reader about these kind of archetypes that we all know and love. And I'm wondering if you can kind of speak specifically to your particular love for these archetypes, like the final girl, the, you know, the slasher themselves, and how you are kind of bringing them to the fold within your stories and pushing them forward, that they're not kind of, you know, that there is a certain kind of forward thinking to them, as opposed to just kind of leaning in on the trope. It's embracing the trope but pushing forward with the trope.
Yeah, I mean that's the wonderful thing about slashers is that as everyone's saying, they grew up at the box office, so these cinematic techniques are baked in and they become like a scaffolding. But I think that's wonderful that we have this rigorous set of steps that we have to process our stories through. And yes, we can find new depth within these stock characters for sure, but we can't forget to have stock characters as well. We got to have those carving dummies. Those are really fun, you know. But the stuff that's baked in, like you know, you open with the blood sacrifice, you've got the slasher cam, you've got the third rail body dump, you've got all that stuff, and it's wonderful to be able to lean on that. But the wonderful thing about having those I don't know, those stanchions in place throughout your story is you can do whatever you want in between, in that sag between. And that's where I live the best, is in those moments between, because yes, I can make somebody I can do an unconventional final girl. I can push back against ideas people have about the killer. And I think that's any whatever genre or art any of us do, I think that's our duty, our responsibility is to try to make it better. And I think none of us are satisfied with just doing what's been done. We want to do a little bit more. We want to build the house of slasher fiction a little better than it has been before so that people can live in it longer.
Wow, that's amazing.
Mhm.
I mean, you mentioned scaffolding, and I love this idea. And
Mhm.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate with
Mhm.
everybody for a second, because slasher fiction shouldn't exist. It shouldn't be as good as it is. And I wanna ask everybody, you know, when I think of film and when I think of what I've seen on the screen, slashers exist within these kind of cinematic conventions of like the killer cam, the kind of point of view of the character of the serial killer themselves, or you know, you have the edit, that you have the actual cut, that you know, the jump scare, that these techniques that we use in film should not translate to the page. And yet, here we are kind of talking about this kind of lush and vibrant subgenre, and it somehow is flourishing. And, you know, I'll start with I'm gonna go for Brian, because I wanna ask, like, what what are the techniques that you take from cinema? What are the ones that you don't? Like, how the hell do you write a slasher? Like, it just doesn't seem possible.
Yeah, it is an interesting kind of conundrum when you think about it through like all those cinematic craft-based tools that work in film versus fiction. And but it's interesting. I'm thinking about how, for example, like jump scares, and how okay, it's really difficult, maybe impossible, to jump scare a reader, but the goal is not really to jump scare the reader is to jump scare the character when I do it, is like create a situation where they see something or they think it's something and they're like, oh crap, and then, oh, it was just a raccoon, right? And you can still play with those tropes that work in film, but also it's interesting because I feel like jump scares, a lot of us feel like they're kind of a bit tired, or you can lean on them too much in films, and we don't want a film that's all about the jump scares. But again, like to process them through a character, you can still execute these tropes in fiction in different ways. And yeah, it's fun to kind of find the different avenues, and for me, like writing is all kind of problem solving. So the challenge of like, okay, how can I tackle this scene or this character from a different perspective, which again is a huge benefit of fiction, is you can write in first person or third person or change characters in the next chapter. That to me is essential for at least how I write slashers, is to be able to have a chapter and jump to focus on a totally different character the way that you can in film. Okay, now the camera's with this person, but we're going a little deeper into their heads, kind of thing.
Stephen, I'd be curious to hear your kind of thoughts on the variation of like a line break or a paragraph break, and the difference of that, and the camera edit, or the kind of the use of literature, like fictional kind of structuring versus cinematic structuring.
You were talking about Last Final Girl. I always forget about the old stuff I've written, so I'm glad you brought that up because I wouldn't have thought of it. But that was my first, well, kind of my second slasher I wrote, I guess. But I wrote both these slashers in the same fashion with camera angles, camera cuts, and you're right, it has arrows, and it breaks in the middle of lines and stuff like that. And I was trying to emulate the feel of a slasher on screen on the page. And who knows how effective I finally was, but it taught me a lot doing it anyways. But yeah, like Brian's saying, jump scares on the page are really hard to fashion. You'll try 10 times to do it and it'll work like half of one time, but that's because the reader controls the pace. If they feel the tension ratcheting up too high, they can go look out the window at a pretty bird and come back, reset. You can't control that. In film, it's rolling past at a steady clicking rate and the audience can do nothing about it. But in a novel, the audience can do a lot about it. What I see with these techniques from cinema that are showing up on the slasher page is, I think slashers are kind of leaning a little bit back on the giallo, actually. Like in the giallo, it was all about, let's show the killer's hands instead of their face, But on the fiction page, we can do that giallo technique, but we don't have to like have the camera looking at hands, because that's kind of stupid. I'm not saying it can't work. It can totally work, I'm sure. Anything can work, but I don't know if I could do it. But in fiction, you can do that Dan Brown trick where you have the bad guy in his or her lair doing their thing, and you just happen to never look at their face, and so you never know who they are, and that's a good way to keep them secret,
Yeah. You mentioned giallo, and I think when I remember reading Security, that novel, that felt very giallo to me, and just the kind of use of location. Yeah, it's so funny to think that. There was the Last Final Girl, and then you mentioned a second one. What was the second one?
Demon Theory back in 2006.
There you go.
Yeah.
Gosh, so going as far back as 2006 as like one of the first, like, tomorrow, whoever's listening to this, they'll say, but wait, there was that one book in, 2003, 2004, and I'll be really curious to hear what it is. But it is amazing to think of like the baby steps of the slasher.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Subgenre.
Yeah.
Josh, I mean, like, for you eat cinema. You devour cinema. Like I think of Shadowglass and just like how like there's something to be said about film kind of entrenches itself into a lot of your writing. So I'm curious, like, you have to be conscious of the kind of cinematic language that's going into your writing. So how does it equate with writing for slashers?
The one thing that I was thinking about jump scares, just real quick, was that I think that in fiction, I think the jump scares are effective when they're actually it's a proper threat. In a lot of slasher films, like one of my favorite slasher films is I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, but that film has a lot of fake scares, which is a big jump, and it turns out to be, like you said, like a beaver or whatever, raccoon. But yeah, I think if in books, often the jump scares actually are scary. There is a real threat there, so that's perhaps why they can be effective. But for me, in terms of like writing, I think I just read a lot of stuff when I was younger that was really cinematic. One of my favorite authors was a guy called Robin Jarvis, who wrote really cinematic children's horror novels. There's a series called The Whitby Witches, which is just a brilliant sort of witchy series. And so just the writing that I was reading as a kid was very cinematic. And I think that's probably why I've always found it so difficult to separate books from film. I kind of see them as the same thing in a lot of ways, which probably isn't very helpful because clearly I have very different strengths and weaknesses. But for me, they are always just about story and the best, most colorful, most interesting way to tell a story.
Angela, you're leaning on your nostalgia in the 80s, so I'm curious, does that also kind of equate to the writing of it? Like, are you using the language of film in your books themselves?
Yeah, I think the language of film for sure. And I started writing kind of late, so I really think like I'm watching a movie. I see the scenes in my mind, and I particularly like watching writing action scenes, which I find other writers don't always. But I think that comes from being raised on film and not writing until later. But the other way that I think nostalgia comes out for me is in music. So up to this point, I'm probably going to run out of songs I like, but my books kind of have a soundtrack. And so I like to think of that. And I think that's kind of cinematic to think of like what song would be playing in the background and find reasons for characters to hear music. For me, really like embeds it in nostalgia and this sense that it's a film with a soundtrack.
In your mind, like, do you think of them as like if this was to kind of come full circle and become the kind of Ouroboros with the snake eating its own tail, like would they adapt Chopping Spree into a film, and it would be of that kind of 80s style and with the amazing soundtrack that we would all buy at the
I think that'd be
weddings?
great, but I
Yeah.
don't know if they could afford the rights to all the music that I have chosen.
They just
Might
get
be kind
someone
of
else to record
expensive.
it.
Yeah.
Just get the kind of like the
Remix.
lesser Taylor Swifty.
Yeah.
But who would be the 80s? Pick who are some of the
Cyndi
songs?
Lauper for sure, Pat Benatar. You know, you've got to get metal in there. Absolutely.
Yeah, you gotta find a dollar store David Lee Roth, man.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of cover bands out there that would probably be very interested.
Oh my God, they would do it. Before we started, I kind of planted the seed of this question because I'm really curious, and I'm putting everybody on the spot, and I'm going to go down the row. But for me, when I think of slasher cinema, you know, there's always that kind of iconic death, like that one scene that you'll be talking about at the playground the next, you know, the next day you're at school. And I mean, I think they even do it now with like, I mean, did everybody see In a Violent Nature? Um, I love that film, and it like has that one death that like everybody's kind of like, oh, there's that one death. I, so I want to turn it around and think specifically about the books that you have written. And I want to ask if I can put you on the spot. Spoilers ahead, forgive us. But if you could pick one iconic scene, one iconic death, one iconic, like, this is the moment that, like, you know, will go down in slasher fiction history as like, oh my God, did you read that one scene? And Candy Cane kills again when she, you know, when they did da. Like, I wanna ask you if you could all pick the one scene for us to share. And Josh, you still there?
I'm here.
All right, we're gonna do it. I want to ask
I'm
you
hanging
first.
in there.
The
I
Wi-Fi
don't know
is
if I can
strong.
spoil. I don't know if I can spoil the name of the character. I kind of want to preserve that maybe for future readers. But I definitely had a character that I created for Heads Will Roll, and I knew that I wanted them to have their epic Sarah Michelle Gellar in I Know What You Did Last Summer, epic chase sequence. And I was really struggling because in Heads Will Roll, the kill chapters are all just one chapter each. So you get the perspective of that character, you get to kind of learn a little bit more about them, and then they die at the end and you feel very bad for them. But with this character, I felt like I wanted to give her something bigger. I've just spoiled the gender, sorry. I wanted to give her something bigger, and I just really couldn't do it. And I spoke to my boyfriend, who is also a writer, and he's far cleverer than I am. And he said, well, why are you restricting yourself to one chapter? Couldn't you do it over a couple of chapters and just kind of keep the ball rolling through those chapters? And then it kind of plays a bit of a fun game with the reader because you see the name of that character as a POV chapter and you think, oh shit, okay, they're going to be gone by the end of this chapter. And maybe they're not. So that's maybe another example of how you could play around with the expectations and tropes of a slasher within the medium of a novel.
Sadists. You're all sadists. This is like you're just like the cat, like pawing at the poor little mouse, and just like, like I'm gonna let you go just a little bit, but I'm gonna grab your tail. No, 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 no. Stephen, could you sift through the back catalog and pick the one scene that you want etched onto your headstone?
The kill scene? You're talking about
Yeah.
kill scene? A kill scene. Yeah, I think the opening chapter, kind of the prologue of Don't Fear the Reaper, where there's that guy, that high schooler at the motel, the Trails End Motel, and that with that girl, and he gets a knock on the door, and it starts a cat and mouse game in the snow, which to me is very Ghostface. I was having fun with Ghostface, of course, with Wes Craven, and I just love that. I love that we never know who it is, and I love that it ends with both of them dead and posed and strung up and everything. But the not knowing who the killer is, not actually seeing the killer's face or their gender or anything about them, to me is the funnest part about that.
Yeah. That's such a good scene.
Mhm.
Brian, I'm really curious. Which one are you gonna pick? What's it gonna be?
Oh, I mean, I'm gonna go with one from the first Candy Cane Kills book. So, spoilers here. And one of the reasons it's a favorite for me, and a lot of readers have pointed to it as the most disturbing one, which is interesting because it's relatively bloodless compared to a lot of the gorier deaths. But it's also the scene when we finally see Candy Cane in all her glory. So she crawls out of the little basement window out into the snow, and a character is running from her. And when he turns around to look back, she's thrown a big old wrench and it hits him in the face, and he's falls back and is choking on teeth and blood. And then she jumps on top of him and sings her Christmas carols and starts making snowballs and shoving them into his mouth and down his throat, and then starts kind of just shoveling more and more snow on top of his face. And so it's a scene where he's like, he doesn't know if he's choking or drowning because the snow is melting and it's both hard and soft and solid and liquid, and that's how the character dies. And it's awful. And it is the scene that I disturbed myself the most with. So I'm not surprised when people read it were like, that was really upsetting. But again, it's not, it's not a decapitation. There's no blood, but it's, for me, the scariest death is the kind of like choking, drowning death. And I was like, hey, I can do them both.
I've told Brian this story before, but I have to share it. But like I remember hearing Brian read from the first Candy Cane Kills book, and I think it was the prologue. It was the beginning, the first chapter,
Yeah.
and like not to give anything away, but like the end of the chapter is essentially Candy Cane saying presence, and it's such an innocuous moment, but like hearing Brian say presence, like the word itself suddenly took on such a foreboding, like sweetness that it was like to this day, I hear like this is only for me. It's like I'm just gonna have this little trauma here, but like every time I hear the word presence, I have this echo where I'll just like be Brian reading his book, impersonating Candy Cane, and just saying presence, I can't even do it. Could you do it, Brian? Can you just? I'm gonna put you on the spot. I want to hear you say, "Give us a candy cane."
Presents.
That's what it is. That's what it is. Now you all have to hear it every time for the holidays. That's my gift to you, dear listener. Thank you. Angela, what is your what is the ultimate death? What is your scene?
Well, I'm actually going to pull one from Frostbite, which is not a slasher. It's a sci-fi horror comedy. But I remember cackling after writing this scene and just like bursting out of my office being so excited. And my husband probably thinking I'm a psychopath. So that's why I'm going to pick it. But I grew up in North Dakota and Minnesota area. And so it's very quintessential to that area. A character has seen his dad get gored by a deer and die, but he's actually infected with alien worms. So he's kind of zombified and he rises again to attack. And the character kills him with a snowmobile. So it's like a lot of chase scene in the street, grabbing onto the snowmobile, hitting him with the snowmobile, and ultimately running him over and like squishing his body with the snowmobile. And I just took a lot of pleasure in that.
It's the little things in life.
It was fun.
Yeah. There, there you go. That's amazing. And do the brainworms get squishy? Like, do they just come out?
No, they're little.
Yeah.
So they would like slither out into something else. And the other funny part about it was the character who's doing it has just like smoked pot. So he's kind of high and he's not sure what's going on. And he's also just eaten a bunch of Doritos. So there's like Dorito dust everywhere. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And very gory.
We kind of spoke, we've touched upon it, but I really want to kind of crack it open just a little bit more. And it is the idea of the killer themselves. And this idea of of creating an iconic character, like a slasher, and how challenging that is, and in this day and age. And Angela kind of mentioned it about that we now have the potential to kind of humanize these slashers, or that we at least have access to them in ways that we might not have on screen. So it's a very broad question, forgive me, but I want to ask you, what is the thinking that goes into your crafting of these slashers, of your slashers, your particular murderers? And given the fact that you're not, it's not on screen, but that you do have the kind of depth of the paragraph, the depth of the book to kind of explore something a little bit more internal. Like what goes into, your crafting of your slasher? Stephen, I'm going to ask you first.
For the Lincoln Indians, I guess that was my third slasher I ever wrote. As far as how I crafted Elkhead Woman, all I really did was I got planted at a banquet table with an entertainment lawyer back in like 2018, something like that, and I convinced him, or not convinced him. I've never convinced him. I was trying to convince him to give me permission, whatever his permission would be worth, to write a Three's Company novel, because I think I can do that like nobody else could, And he insisted that I could not do that, and so I finally threw my hands up and said, "All right, I won't do that, but I'm going to write a Friday the 13th novel." And he had all the same objections. I can't write a Friday the 13th novel, and I really wanted to take Jason Voorhees up to the reservation and see how he'd fare against some Blackfeet. So I left thinking, he's wrong. I can do a Jason Voorhees novel. And so the way I did a Jason Voorhees novel was I peeled off the hockey mask and put an elk head on, and which is to say I built my slasher on the shape of another slasher, really. To me, Elkhead Woman is just like a version of Jason Voorhees, and maybe everything is a version of Jason Voorhees, or I don't know, Michael Myers or Peeping Tom. I don't know. We can go back and back, but I think it would be presumptuous of me to think I can just come up with something completely new. Maybe I luck into new aspects of something, but the trick is for the audience to connect with it. It has to be both familiar, but have that sheen of newness, I think. And the way I do it anyways is, just put a different mask on somebody, I think. Like even with Last Final Girl, it's a killer he wears like a red motorcycle looking jacket, a white glove, and a Michael Jackson mask, and So I get to have fun with Michael Jackson's face, and every time he's about to kill somebody, he hears Billie Jean coming from the trees, and he don't know who's playing that music. It's just the book playing the music, you know. But there's endless fun you can have, and I think we can't be too anxious about the influence of everything that's come before. We've got to embrace it. We can't, I mean, some people say they don't like the slasher because everything's been done. All the holidays are used up. You can only kill somebody so many ways, but I don't subscribe to that even a little. I think there is endless ways to kill people. There's endless masks to use. There's endless ways to do it. And maybe those of us in this call, we're the ones who can keep doing it, you know?
Brainstorm session after this Zoom call. Brian, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was something I was very conscious of in writing candy cane books and thinking about, and that was really what I started with when I knew I wanted to write a Christmas slasher. The name Candy Cane, CAIN, came first. And then I did a quick Google and I was like, has this been done before? Has anybody named a character this? And gratefully not. And I reverse engineered the character from there. And I knew that I wanted, to me, it's similar to what we've been saying about what's so great about slasher fiction is you get to have more insight into a character. And for the slasher to have a sympathetic backstory for the killer is always more compelling to me. To have a hint of kind of sadness and then, you know, some righteous vengeance, I don't know, adds a dimension that I think is fun to explore. And then also for me, key is like the visual element that Stephen was talking about. Like what are we seeing? Because it is, you know, the cinematic legacy is like that visual, the silhouette, the clothing, the mask. So I was actually visiting my brother, and my niece and nephew had these matching red and white striped pajamas, and I was like, oh, that'd be cool. And but yeah, I think there is just, it's fascinating to me the kind of iconography that goes into these characters, and the kind of weapon of choice of it all. But for me, yeah, it's all about the backstory.
Angela, what do you think?
Well, I think, you know, one of the interesting things about slashers sometimes is we all got to be honest, sometimes we're rooting for them to win, right? Even though they're the bad guy. Usually they're there for a reason. There was a prank or something that went wrong that resulted in them showing up. Even though their aim might not always be at the people that deserve it, we're sometimes kind of like rooting for them. So that's kind of, I think, where I try to think about it is, as a reader, how can I give like them even more of a reason to root for the killer? Like, what is the backstory that they would be like, yeah, I kind of understand. This is like reasonable that this would be their reaction. I think that's a fun way to kind of craft your slasher.
Josh, how did you craft your slashers?
With the Needleman in Burn the Negative, I kind of wanted to have a slasher villain who was just very much sort of emblematic of a slasher villain. I didn't really want to like reinvent the wheel. I didn't want the slasher to take over the story, because for me, Burn the Negative is very much about Laura, the cursed movie. And I felt like if the villain was too much of a thing, it would actually overpower everything else. So for me, the Needleman was like this composite creation of clearly Freddy Krueger. You've got a bit of the fisherman from I Know We Did Last Summer with the outline and the black coat and stuff. You've got a bit of Dark Man with the bandages around the face. A little bit of like point horror style villain sort of going in there as well. So that was its own thing. And then with Knock Knock Nancy in Heads Will Roll, I was thinking about upstate New York, Sleepy Hollow. I kind of thought maybe having a slasher on horseback would be pushing it a little too far into the realms of insanity. So I thought, okay, let's gender flip it and have a killer who's female, and just play around with expectations in that sense. And yeah, Knock Knock Nancy just kind of rolled out of my brain. I didn't really give it that much thought, to be honest. She appeared, and then as I was writing, her backstory came to me over the edits, basically.
Amazing. Zeus's head just cracks open and out comes
Yeah.
knock knock Nancy. Um, we're coming to a close, guys, and I don't want to keep Josh past his bedtime too much. But I really I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask the kind of age-old question of what are we gonna read? What are we gonna watch? Like what are our recommendations in terms of I'll let you guys pick a film and a book. But I you know there's a lot of slashers here, but like, who's someone else that we should read? Like, what's a book that's out there that you think we should read? And like, what is like one of the films? What's a deep cut? Like, I'd be curious. Like, yes, we know Halloween, we know I Know What You Did, but like, is there something a little bit deeper under the strata that you feel like we should share with everybody? Um, Brian, I'm going to start with you.
Damn, that's a tough one to get first on. All right, so book wise, I read a great collection by Amanda Cecilia Lang called Saturday Fright at the Movies. And it is a nostalgic throwback to so many different subgenres, but especially kind of there's a few different spins on the slasher genre in those stories that I found just absolutely delightful. Um, and oh, you know what I'll say for movies? I have never gone through all of the Children of the Corn movies, and just recently watched 2 and 3, and both 2 and 3 are way better than I expected. And 3 especially has some really gnarly slasher kills, um, including the corn just like pulling a dude's head out and his spine kind of coming with it. There's some wild stuff in there. So I would posit that folks should give the Children of the Corn franchise another peek.
Just the first three?
Yeah,
Are
I've
you
heard that it
forging ahead?
goes.
Like, are you gonna keep going?
From what I've read, it goes real downhill from there. But that's also, I don't know, that's part of being a slasher fan, right? It's like you gotta keep going. You gotta see it all the way through.
You gotta commit. They make them. You'll be there.
Yeah.
Opening night. Angela, what would you recommend?
I would say movie-wise, Totally Killer, since I'm on like a nostalgia kick, is great. Time travel slasher where a girl essentially travels back in time to kill the slasher that eventually killed her mother. But it's also really funny because it's like a modern person's look at how things were in the 80s and how problematic they were. Like, dodgeball and all kinds of really problematic things. So I thought that one was really funny and smart. And then as far as books, I'd say You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight by Kaylin Barron, which is basically a slasher camp. You go to participate in a slasher in a safe environment that goes horribly wrong. And of course, people actually end up dying. And I love that one. I felt like the ending totally surprised me and it went in a direction I wasn't expecting.
Oh, there you go. Josh, what would you recommend?
I was going to recommend You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight as well. Yeah, so I do have a backup. I haven't read it yet. I'm waiting for it to arrive in the post, but there's a new book by an author called Matthew Mercer called Summer Camp for Slasher Victims. I don't know if anybody else has read it, but it looks awesome. So I'm going to be reading that next. And movies, I don't know if this is considered a deep cut, but I don't see tons of people talking about it. There's a film called The Final Girls from 2015,
Yeah.
which has not Vera Farmiga, Tessa Farmiga, and Marlon Ackerman, and it's just such a lovely, fun, warm-hearted slasher story.
I love that one. That's a sweet one. That's great. What's the name of the book you recommended again? I want to write it down. I want to make sure I get it.
Oh, Summer Camp for Slasher Victims by Matthew
Summer-
Mercer.
Okay, Matthew Mercer. Awesome. Thank you. Stephen, what would you recommend? I feel like reading your acknowledgments is always kind of like that's, I, I have to go to the video store shortly thereafter, but like what like if you had to pick a couple for us tonight.
A couple. I would say Last Girl Standing. Have some of y'all seen Last Girl Standing? It's brutal, man. It's what is that, 2015, maybe 2017? It occupies the story space after the slasher has visited. And what are the like what's the trauma fallout basically? It's brutal. I would also recommend Hellbent. It's I want to say from probably '04 or so. It's LA slasher shot over like 2 years. So the actors, the characters kind of start to look a little different. But man, that story is really good. It really strips the slasher down to its core components. I love Hellbent. But also like slashers happen on television too. Harper's Island, I think, is the best slasher series we've had from what is that, 2008 or something? That is an amazing series. I rewatch it probably every 15 months or so, just so I can remember what happiness is. As for books, well, actually, I should do comic books too. I would say for comic books, what about Nailbiter? Do y'all know Nailbiter, huh? Nailbiter is brutal and over the top. It's fun. There's one happening right now, Petra. It's really good. It's like a four issue limited thing. But for books, if I'm gonna deep dive, I would say, and it could very well be that this is one of y'all writing under a pseudonym. I've never figured out who this is. I've never asked too hard either. Jack Quaid's Escape from Happydale trilogy. Do y'all know that? It could be self-published, I don't even know, but I assume Jack Quaid is not a real person. I think it's like a mask somebody's wearing. That's my own like conspiracy theory. But those books are so fun. Whoever Jack Quaid is, or maybe it's like six people writing together, I don't even know. But they understand the slasher fairly well. Oh, and
Turns out.
also wait, there's one more that nobody knows about. Young Slasher by an Australian. It's a self-published book, and I think they're Australian and their last name might be like Brandeis, something like that. But Young Slasher, it may not be, maybe it's gettable. Hopefully it's still gettable, but I read that, shoot, many, many years ago, and it's never left me. It's really a really cool story.
Turns out Josh, Angela, and Brian are actually all Jack Quaid. They've been
Yeah.
writing, they've been cranking out that series for years. You caught us. Mask comes off. We're all Jack Quaid. Deep down, aren't we all Jack Quaid on the inside? You guys are some of the loveliest sadists I've ever had the pleasure of talking to. This was just lovely. I think I needed some slashers this month. Like November, I was trying to figure out like there was definitely that moment of like, oh man, what are we gonna do? Like what's this month's fearmongers gonna be? Because there's a little bit of fear out there right now. So but bringing it back to slashers, it is a comfort and it is something that feels, I don't know, just really fun and oddly joyous. And I just want to say thank you to my guests for, yeah, bringing the fun back to fear. Everybody, Angela Sylvaine, Brian McAuley, Stephen Graham Jones, and Josh Winning, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Please pick up Heads Will Roll, Chopping Spree, Candy Cane Kills, or Candy Cane Kills again. And I was a teenage slasher. There's just so many to go. And if you can kind of pick the book, if someone out there can kind of like poke and DM or post like this is when slashers really started to kind of take off. Like I want to know if there's like a book out there that really kind of starts kind of laying down the map posts for the Renaissance that we're in. Because otherwise, Steven's going to claim it. He's going to put down his stake. It's going to be his. Everybody, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you, guests. Have a lovely, lovely, lovely evening. Stay safe out there.